15 years after a young man was brutally killed in Sunderland, a woman walked into a police station carrying a secret that had followed her for more than a decade. She was not being chased. She was not confronted by new evidence. Nobody forced her to speak. She simply walked through the doors and told police something that would reopen one of the city's most haunting murder cases. Her name was Karen Tunmore, and the words she said that day connected her to the death of 19-year-old Scott Pritchard. But the confession created a mystery of its own. What could make someone stay silent for 15 years and then suddenly decide they could no longer hide the truth? In 2019, a case that had remained unresolved for years suddenly returned to the spotlight. For almost 15 years, Scott Pritchard's family had lived without the answers they desperately wanted. A young man had lost his life. Someone knew what happened, but the person responsible had remained unknown. Then Karen Tunmore came forward. Her confession gave investigators something they had been searching for since 2004: a person connected to Scott's death. But for detectives, this was not the end of the investigation. It was the beginning of a new one. Because a confession after 15 years raises difficult questions. Why now? What happened during all those years of silence? And was this the complete story? To understand why this confession shocked Sunderland, we have to go back to November 2004. Before his name appeared in a murder investigation, before his story became connected to a 15-year mystery, Scott Pritchard was a 19-year-old young man whose life was still ahead of him. At an age when many people are just beginning to discover their future, Scott's future was suddenly taken away. He was not just a victim in a case file. He was a real person whose life mattered to the people around him. One night in Sunderland, everything changed. In the early hours of November 2004, Scott was found suffering from severe head injuries after a violent attack. Emergency services rushed to save him. But despite medical efforts, Scott later died from those injuries. Investigators were left with a question that would follow the case for years. Who attacked Scott Pritchard? And why did the answer remain hidden for so long? But the most important clue in this case would not come from a new discovery at the crime scene. It would come from someone who had been living with the secret since the beginning. Before Scott Pritchard became known because of a murder investigation, there was a life that existed beyond the headlines. Scott was 19 years old, an age when most people are still building their future, making memories, and discovering where life might take them. But on one night in Sunderland, that future was taken away. To investigators, Scott would become the center of a serious criminal investigation. But to the people who knew him, he was something much more important. A son, a friend, a person whose story should have continued. And that is what makes his case so tragic. Because behind every investigation file is a human being whose life existed long before the crime. In November 2004, the quiet streets of Sunderland became the setting for a violent attack. In the early hours of the morning, Scott Pritchard was found with severe head injuries. The injuries were so serious that investigators quickly understood they were not dealing with an ordinary incident. Someone had attacked Scott. Someone had left him critically injured. And somewhere, there was a person who knew exactly what happened. Scott was taken for medical treatment. But despite efforts to save him, his injuries proved fatal. At only 19 years old, Scott's life came to an end. After Scott's death, Detectives began trying to rebuild the events of that night. They needed to understand what happened before the attack. Who had been near Scott? Who had information? And what had led to such a violent confrontation? Investigators followed leads and examined the circumstances surrounding the case. But the breakthrough they needed did not come. As the years passed, Scott's case entered a painful period of uncertainty. The investigation remained a reminder of a question that had never been answered. Who was responsible for Scott Pritchard's death? 15 years passed between the night Scott died and the day Karen Tonmore walked into a police station. 15 years in which the truth remained known only to those who had been there. But while the world moved forward, one secret continued to follow the people connected to that night. And then, after years of silence, something happened that changed the entire direction of the case. A confession that forced investigators to look back at a night they had never forgotten. In 2019, after almost 15 years of uncertainty, the Scott Pritchard case took a dramatic turn. Karen Tonmore walked into a police station and told officers she was involved in Scott's death. For investigators, this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. But it also created a new challenge. A confession from 15 years ago could not simply be accepted without examination. Detectives had to look at the details carefully. Did her account match the known facts? Did it explain what happened on that night in 2004? And were there still other people connected to the attack who had never been identified? Because after so many years, the question was no longer only who was responsible. It became, how much of the story was finally being revealed? After Tonmore came forward, investigators reopened the details surrounding Scott's death. They examined her statement and compared it with the information already gathered during the original investigation. The confession gave police a new direction. A case that had remained without a clear answer for years suddenly had a person connected to the crime. But the investigation was not only about proving what Tonmore had said, it was also about understanding the events that led to Scott's death. Detectives had to separate what was confirmed from what was only claimed. They had to establish exactly what role Tonmore had played, and whether anyone else was involved. The confession opened the door to answers. But behind that door were even more questions. One of the most significant parts of Tonmore's account was the claim that another person was also connected to what happened to Scott. This changed the investigation completely. Because if another person was involved, then the story of that night was larger than one confession. Investigators now faced another question. Had every person connected to Scott's death finally been found? Or was there still someone else who knew the truth and had remained silent? However, it is important to separate facts from theories. The confirmed facts are that Scott Pritchard died after a violent attack in Sunderland in 2004. The case remained unresolved for years, and Karen Tonmore later admitted her involvement. But the complete circumstances surrounding that night continued to raise questions. And that is what made the case so unusual. The confession answered one part of the mystery, but it also revealed how much remained unknown. Because after 15 years of searching for the truth, investigators finally had an answer. But they also discovered that one answer could lead to even bigger questions. For 15 years, Scott Pritchard's family lived with a question that no family should ever have to carry. What really happened to him? The years after Scott's death were not just about an investigation. They were about waiting for information, waiting for justice, waiting for the truth about a person they had lost. Because behind every murder case is more than evidence and court documents. There are families who continue living with the impact of one moment that changed everything. Scott was only 19 years old, a young man whose future was still ahead of him, a future filled with possibilities that would never happen. When Karen Tonmore finally confessed, it marked a major moment in the case. After years of uncertainty, someone connected to Scott's death had finally come forward. But justice does not always bring complete peace. A confession can explain part of what happened. A court decision can hold someone accountable. But neither can reverse the damage caused by losing a life. And even after the confession, people were still left asking, why did it take 15 years for the truth to emerge? Was every detail of that night in 2004 finally known? And was the complete story ever revealed? The Scott Pritchard case is a reminder that some investigations are not only about finding a person responsible, they are also about understanding the silence that surrounds a tragedy. For 15 years, a secret remained buried. Then one day, someone decided to reveal what they knew. But sometimes, the truth does not arrive as a perfect ending. Sometimes, it arrives with missing pieces. A young man lost his life. A family waited years for answers. And a confession finally brought a chapter of the story into the light. But one question continues to surround this case. After 15 years of silence, did the world ever truly hear everything that happened to Scott Pritchard? Every mystery has a moment when the truth begins to surface. But some stories stay with us because even after the answers arrive, the questions do not disappear. This was the story of Scott Pritchard. A life lost, a secret kept, and a truth that waited 15 years to be heard. If stories like this remind you that every case has a human story hidden beneath the headlines, subscribe to Dark Meridian, where we uncover the mysteries, secrets, and forgotten moments that history refuses to leave behind.